It's amazing how often the song they sing fits real well with what we're going to speak about. Bonnie, why don't you just introduce your sister for everybody? I forgot it. No, not everybody got to meet her.
This is my sister Colleen.
Hi, Colleen. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
We've been doing a series, if you recall, on Joseph, and we're on the part 7. And if you remember on the song that they just sang, it deals a lot with perspective. And I think perspective is so important. So often, how many of us are on a vertical perspective, going with God, and how many of us are on a horizontal perspective? Most of the time, I think we get in trouble in the horizontal. And I think you can see that with Jacob, and he could have done much better if he's more consistent, looking up instead of just looking around. So I think about it, so much of our things happen in life, it has to do with our choices. So just kind of a review, if you remember the first 6 weeks we've done. We started off with a dysfunctional family, you remember? We showed just how there's a lot of deception in the home, the roles were messed up within the home. They had problems with discipline. And they also then dissatisfied in the home, obviously taking place. But we can call Joseph one of the great saints of Scripture. But yet, how could he be great coming from a dysfunctional family? And I think it's important. We don't blame it on our surroundings. We can arise above it and become what God wants us to be. We also looked, remember, we had the second week, we talked about please be patient with me, God's not finished with me yet. And just talked about how God was working in all the brothers' lives, from where they started to where they ended up. And God's working in our lives as well as we saw it in Jacob's life. We then also saw the dream. Remember, Joseph had 2 dreams. And did he end up with the dream life? Well, did God fulfill the dream? Okay, so I think it's important. He had the dream life, but how many of us would want to have that dream life? But I think it's important. God's dream for our life may not be our dream for our life. And the only way you're going to be happy is when you get on God's dream and in God's time. And so I think it's important for us to look at it. If you saw the 4th week, you remember we looked at it, the God's will, God's way, and in God's time, and the dangers we saw about how taking matters into our own hands. How many of you ever tried to speed up God's stuff and do it your way? How many of us have had God to come in and constantly clean up our mistakes? We also saw, remember, the dungeons of the possibilities, of the difficulties. We saw 4 of it, but unrestricted things happen all of a sudden. Remember, he's in prison, he's free one day, and next minute he's in prison. You saw the undeserved treatment, whether it be from his brother or from Potiphar or whoever it might be. We also saw just the development in God's furnace. God was developing them. The following week, remember, we looked at the dross being removed. How many of you like it when God's removing dross in your life? You like that furnace, being in that furnace, and God's having to take things away? But you remember, that's when it finally developed. And you think about it, if Joseph hadn't have left, he had 10 older brothers, how well would he have developed as a leader? With all of them in the home, and with them, obviously, the pecking order would have taken place. It's just amazing how much at the age of 30, what all he was put in responsible for. Last week, remember, we saw seeing God's hand, allowing God's hand, and then working with God's hand. And I think Joseph could see it in his life, but Jacob quite often did not. So let's think about that. Perspective does play an important part, like we've saw, some of you might remember in history, when the one astronaut stepped on the moon and talked about how he could see God and see his handiwork. And on another mission, remember the astronaut stepped off and said he couldn't see God anywhere. How could one see him and one not see him? Weren't they both looking at the same thing? And the same thing can happen. We can do the same. Do we see God in creation, or do we just simply see some beautiful things? So I think it's important for us to think about our perspective, our choices we have in life, and how it affects us horizontally as well as vertically. Let's look at just some kind of in background. Remember, go to Genesis chapter 22, look a little bit in the past, the choices of horizontal and vertical. And you'll notice in chapter 42, remember this is after the brothers have had their first visit, And obviously Joseph knows who they are and his treatment of them, and obviously the guilt that's going on with the brothers. You notice how Jacob responds in 36 down to 38 of chapter 42. And their father Jacob said to them, talking about to the brothers that went, the 10, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me. Which way is which way is Jacob looking? He's looking at his circumstances. Everything is just, oh, woe is me. Everything's terrible. In actuality, is God working? God's working in these other sons' lives. He's about to have a great union, about to save the family. But all he sees is what? The circumstances. Notice Reuben said, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring them back. Put him in my care and I'll return him. And Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you. By the way, how many sons did Reuben have? He's offering 2 of them. So how many did he have? It actually will tell you in a couple of chapters. He had 4. So why is he offering 2? Was Reuben partially responsible for Joseph being no more? And would he be responsible if Benjamin didn't come back? So Jacob would have lost 2 sons, and he's saying what? I'm offering 2 of mine in exchange. Now that's being a pretty good responsible son. And the development's taking place. Obviously, they just got their food back, so he's basically telling them no. But what about the vertical? He also, when food runs out, and notice then when you got to chapter 43, notice in verse 14. And notice Jacob is now speaking again, and he recognizes they're out of food, they're about to die without it, and everybody's going to die. Notice he says, and may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of the man, that he should be released to you, your other brother and Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. And now he's looking which way? He looks to upward now, doesn't he? And when it says God Almighty, how many of you know what word that is? It's used earlier in chapter, what's that? El Shaddai, that is correct. It was used in chapter 17, which means basically God is on a mountain, and he's over everything. You're about to go to Pharaoh, and he's the ruler of the known world, the most powerful man, and what's Jacob saying? You may be going before the most powerful man, but there's a God who's above him. So notice 1 minute you have Jacob is looking what? At his circumstances, and his surroundings, and his woe is me, and everything's terrible. But then he's also battling with, I need to look up. And it'd be great if he would have told his sons as soon as they came back, well, hey, I don't understand it. Let's turn straight to God. What does he want me to do? And I think it's good for all of us to think about it. A little later, if you remember in 43, we saw it last week, remember when they bring their money back and they give it to the steward? And the steward, remember in 43, says, be at ease. What Hebrew word do you think that is? Shalom. Don't you think it'd be interesting when they're scared to death and they come before him and this steward speaking in their tongue says, hey, shalom, be at peace, buddy. That's the last thing you'd think would be happening. And then notice he says, your God and the God of your father is the one who gave you your money back. So the steward is basically saying, hey, don't look horizontally, look vertically. God's in charge, and I know I had your money. I put it back on purpose because God told me to. And I think it's important. How many of us get so looking only at our circumstances and we don't see God and his promises and his provisions? So I think when you're in difficult times, and we all will face them at different times, are we looking simply at the surroundings? And I've kind of coined it how many of us have the Haman philosophy? Remember Haman? The wicked man, obviously he hated the Jews and wasn't a godly man by any means. But when everybody bowed down except for how many? He was upset about what? How many of us we're like that in our life? Everything's going well except for 1 or 2 things, and what do we dwell on? Aren't we acting like Haman? Why aren't we looking at all the things that are going right? And that's what I love about Paul in Philippians chapter 4. He's in prison. And what's he say? Rejoice in the Lord all. And he says, I'm content. I've learned to be content. How are you content in a Roman prison? It all has to do with our perspective and our attitude, doesn't it? Is it vertical or is it horizontal? Notice the second thing I think we have in chapter 44. You notice Judah's not going to speak up. They're running out of food, and he said he could have already made the trip twice. And notice what he does in chapter 44, verse 31 to 34. So our first choice is horizontal or vertical. Our second choice, notice in 31 to 34, he's speaking, he says, "And come about, when you see that the lad is not with us, he will die. Thus your servant will bring gray hair as servant on our father." He remembering this is Judah speaking to Joseph. "Your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, If I do not bring him to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as slave to your Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father?" Has he already seen the evil overtaking when he thought he lost Joseph? Who's the one that recommended selling Joseph as the slave? Judah did. And then Judah saw the outcome. So notice now he's going just the opposite. Before, Judah cared about who? Himself. He could care less about Joseph, care less about his dad. Now you're talking about 25 years later, and he's doing what? He cares about his dad. And notice that I will be a slave. And notice he doesn't know who he's speaking about. Does he really believe that he could become a slave the rest of his life? So notice again a choice. Am I going to be myself? Or is it going to be others? And it's interesting because before he chose self. I could care less about Joseph. He's just a thorn in my flesh. Now I care more about my dad and I care more about my brothers, that I'll stay here as a slave. You let them go free. A good development that takes place. So again, we can ask ourselves, do I care more about others than myself? And I think it's a great development. Yeah. Where are we in our own life? Who do I care most about? And I think it's important. So notice the first choice is horizontal or vertical. Second one was others or self. Notice in chapter 5, I think it's interesting, chapter 45, in verse 1 to 15, it's some fabulous things about Joseph. And notice Joseph now, when he can't take it any longer, he reveals himself to his brothers. And it's amazing. He's weeping, and notice in verse 3, and Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph," which, by the way, what language do you think he's not talking to? He's not speaking their native tongue, and they understand. And notice, but his brothers could not answer, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer." And they came closer. Why do you think he wanted to come closer? Because you think they're going to start seeing facial recognition? Notice when you're how many times have you ever go to a place and you see people, but because you're wearing different clothes, they don't recognize you? It happens a lot because I work at the refinery and I go places wearing refinery clothes and people don't recognize who I am, or when I wear church clothes. But notice they didn't recognize it. Now they can see it and they recognize, hey, this really is Joseph. But notice then what he says starting in verse 5. And notice how many times could he be bitter right now? Could he get even with him right now? And notice what he has to say in the next few verses and how many times he talks about God and not himself. Notice in verse 5. "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Verse 6. "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years. There's still 5 more years in which they'll neither be plowing nor harvesting." So this is their second trip, so apparently they're having to go once a year. Notice then in 7. "God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in earth and keep you alive by a great deliverance." Notice it again in verse 8. God. "But now therefore it is not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me like a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all the household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to your father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord over all of Egypt. Come down and do not delay." Notice then, is Joseph talking about himself, or is he talking about the sovereignty of God and how God's done everything? Did Joseph have a part? He had to be faithful all the way through, go through the developmental process, through the furnace, all the different developing things. But he recognizes God's hand all the way through, and God's what put me here. So I think it's interesting. How many of us would take credit for all of it? I went to college, I worked hard, I did this, I put in all these hours. All that may be true, but Joseph recognizes it is the sovereignty of God that put me here. And don't get upset. God put me here to save your life. And it's amazing how you look at it. You go on a little bit. What about with Pharaoh? He then also is going to put him in Goshen, which is the most fertile land that they had. It's also going to later have a different name. Ramses is what's going to later become. But notice then, meets Pharaoh, and then notice what Pharaoh does in verse 17, how we see God working through Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said in verse 17, said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load up your beasts and go to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your household and come to me, and I'll give you the best of the land of Egypt. You shall eat of the fat of the land. Now you are ordered, do not this, take the wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Do not concern yourself with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Did they deserve it?
No.
Why are they getting all this?
God's reason.
The sovereignty of God, and also the service of who? Joseph. They're reaping the benefits of the person that they sold, but notice Joseph doesn't have any bitterness. He recognizes God and how God was using him. Just simply an instrument in God's hand. How many of us will recognize we are likewise instruments wherever we're at? We think, well, I'm just a little person who doesn't do much. Well, was the person leading Billy Graham very important to Christ? How do you know who's in your class or who you meet or who's in your family that isn't the next one? And so I think it's interesting. You have the self or the sovereignty of God. Go a little bit later, but notice the problem or the tendency we can have, how we can get into this. Notice in verse 24, when he's sending them back, notice how Joseph's now speaking. So he sent his brothers, and as they departed, he said to them what? Don't quarrel. Some things never change. Now, how many of you ever had family reunions and everything goes fine for the first day, but then when everybody's together, it doesn't matter if it's 40 years later that you still have the certain one personality things that come up. Notice then he's telling them what again? Don't go back to yourself in quarreling, but remember what all God has done and the miracle that is happening in you guys' life and in family. And stress that and think about that. How many of us are always thinking of the horizontal, but not thinking of the vertical? And even on that trip back. So obviously, has Joseph made a trip or two with him? Quarreling and things going on, and it'd be very normal. So think about it. Do we have the choice of horizontal or vertical? The choice of others or ourselves? We have a choice of, is it just me or is the sovereignty of God? I recognize what all God's doing. How many of us see God working in your life or in your circumstances? It's amazing how God can put you in certain places, but we need to give him credit. Let's look at the next one you have. It's interesting in chapter 46 then, when they come. It's interesting also how they're going. But notice then, when they come, and notice then what happens if you notice the end of in verse 28 of chapter 45, Israel says, remember that would also be Jacob, it is enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I'll go and see him before I die. So he wants to go down and see him, obviously. Notice in 46. So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba. Now what happened to Beersheba earlier? That's when God spoke to him with Esau, remember? So he's coming back. Now notice then, he offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Now notice who's initiating this. I'm going down to Egypt, stops here at Beersheba, and obviously he's going to God with sacrifices, and he's obviously going to him in prayer. Now why would he be going to him in prayer? How many of you know your history? Chapter 12 of Genesis, there's a famine, and Abraham was told to go to Egypt and sojourn there. What happens when you go on to the next one in chapter 26, in verse 2? There's a famine, Isaac, his father, was thinking of going to Egypt, and God said, no, don't go to Egypt, stay with the Philistines. So now you're talking about going to Egypt. Your grandfather, it was good for him to go, but your father was told not to go. So I want to go visit my son, but should I stay there? What should happen? What is my God? What do you want me to do when I get to Egypt? Should I go? Should I stay? Whatever. It's interesting how he's asking. So notice then what God answers him then in his dream. In verse 2, God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here am I. I'm the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I'll make you a great nation there. I'll go down with you to Egypt. I'll also certainly bring you up again. Joseph will close your eyes. Should he go? So does he have a choice of obedience? He has a choice. Is it an obstacle? You think about it, in the middle of a famine, now you have all these things you're bringing, but what kind, you think about it, how quickly that happened. 1 minute you're in the middle of a famine, you're sojourning in the land that God's promised you. The next minute God says what? Leave, and leave everything and go down to a place. How old was he at this time, by the way? He's 130. He dies at 147. So think about it. How do you want to move that late in life? And everything you've known, you're now leaving. But God says to move. And notice, so you think about what he's facing with his family and bringing all this large group with you. Okay, so it's an obstacle or an opportunity. So he then leaves, and the chariots and they carry him down there with all his sons and grandsons and his daughters and so on. And it tells you, then it's going to start listing all the different ones that go. But think about it. How many of us are being obedient? Am I obedient even if it doesn't make sense? Or you think about, I'm just going to sojourn for a while and come back. If you remember in chapter 15 of Genesis, it says they're going to sojourn for 400 years, which later, doesn't mention Egypt, but later then obviously it was shown that it was Egypt, which is what's going to take place here. But how many of us are a choice of being obedient or not? How many of us, the God ever told you to do something, you debated about doing it or not? Still wondering about doing it or not? Or how many of you ever made the wrong decision and didn't do it? Kind of like with Jonah, and you had to get a little bit of a spanking. It's happened to most of us, I think. Notice when you get into the also part, the obstacle or the opportunity, it's amazing when you look through all of them and the different sons that are now listed. And notice in 28 then, the obstacles or the opportunities. Jacob now sends Judah ahead. Who's becoming the leader of the family? Judah is. Natural leader. He was earlier. He's even developing more and more of the leadership. He sends him on ahead to Goshen, so he's going to go find out where they need to go because they're obviously moving slower with everybody. You think about how much provisions that was being sent. How valuable are those provisions in the middle of a famine? You think about it all the way, and who footed the bill? Pharaoh did. You didn't have to pay a dime to move. Pharaoh's paying for everything, and he gave you all kinds of things. And you also got to ride in style. You got to ride in stuff. So you think about it, that also is going to show protection because obviously people are going to recognize what's coming, and they're going to recognize if you attack you, you're attacking who? You're attacking Pharaoh, and you better leave it alone. So here you think about the obstacles that you have and what's going on, and it's interesting then what happens. I think it's interesting, an obstacle or an opportunity. Now notice then Joseph is now in verse 28 through 47, first part. He's now going to have a meeting with his family and with Pharaoh. And so notice what he does. You can decide whether you think it's right or not. But notice in verse 31 of chapter 46, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I'll go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to you, my brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock. They have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. Come about that when Pharaoh calls you and says, what's your occupation? That you shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from the youth even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. Okay, Joseph's saying what? Now you're shepherds. You also have other livestock, but when you go before Pharaoh, just tell him you're what? Don't talk about being a shepherd,
Keeper of livestock.
because they hate shepherds. You need to just tell them you're keeper of livestock. Is that deception? Interesting when you think about it. A half-truth, whatever. Well, it is truth as well. But notice what they do. In chapter 47, they go and they present it in verse 1. And notice in verse 2, Joseph, he took 5 men from among his brothers. Doesn't say which ones. Presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" So they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." Were they diplomatic? Or were they totally honest?
They were honest.
When they went before Joseph, too, by the way, were they totally honest in every question they were asked? How did Joseph find out about his brother, Benjamin? How did they find out about their father, if he's alive or not? Before, notice the family trait of deception, but notice how they're being totally honest every single time. Amazing how they're doing it. Development that's taking place in their life and being honest. They're honest, but it's interesting how Pharaoh responds. And they said to Pharaoh, notice another good thing they do. One is they tell him the truth, we're shepherds. 2, we have come to sojourn in the land. Their plan was what? We're here for another 5 years till the famine is over, and our plan is to do what? Their plan was never to stay. And that was God's plan. But hey, we're just here. We're not trying to take your land, move you out of the best, to get your best from you. We're just here to sojourn until we can go back. And that was their plan. Notice Pharaoh then, it's interesting what he says. He tells them to live in the land of Goshen, which is the most fertile. How many of you would be willing to give up your most fertile land to somebody else, a stranger, a foreigner? But because of Joseph, he is. Notice it's also interesting in verse 6, something else he says to him. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father, your brothers, and the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. Notice then in verse 6, if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Now what? Obviously, he believes it's a family trait. Joseph is so good at what he's done. You got anybody who's good with livestock, I'll put him in charge of mine. He's doing a great job, and I think you guys can too. Now, it's amazing when you think about it. They're being honest and how they're being rewarded. I think it's great. So think about it. The choices of obedience, the obstacles, and the opportunities. What does God desire more, obedience or sacrifice? Obedience. Do you only see the obstacles or the possibilities? What did Joseph see? And what did his dad normally see? How is my personal walk with the Lord? You notice his brothers are developing. Let's think of the last one. I think it's interesting, the choices that you also have, not only with the obstacles, but choices with your work. Notice in chapter 47, and notice in verse 12, when they come down, you remember there's 5 more years of famine. That would have taken them a while to get there, so 4.5 years, whatever you might say. Notice in verse 12, Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his family's household with food according to their little ones. Did they all get the same amount? No. They all got what? They noticed what they needed. Okay, if you've read the previous chapter, Reuben had 4 sons, and then his family. How many sons did Benjamin have? 10. Benjamin had 10. So does Benjamin's family need more? So notice, and by the way, what did they have to give? You'll see later on what it's going to cost the Egyptians, but it didn't cost Joseph's family. Notice then when I say doing your work as unto the Lord, and starting in verse 13 to the end of the chapter, you remember Joseph is acting on behalf of Pharaoh to do what is best for Pharaoh, doing his work heartily unto the Lord. So first when they come to get food, remember they put aside 20% of record yields every year for 7 years. So first when they come in verse 14, notice how the people get the food to live. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in Egypt for the grain for which they bought it. Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So first when they come, they bring their money. Well, now they're going to run out of money. So Pharaoh has all the money of all of Egypt, as well as the surrounding nations running to him. Okay, well, now what do you do? Okay, you run out of money. So notice in verse 16, they come to him. 15, if in the end, notice, give us food, for we're going to die, our money's gone. Then Joseph, give up your livestock, and I'll give you food. Okay, so now what happens to the livestock? Which, by the way, if you don't have any food, how long is your livestock going to live? And without food, how long are you going to live? So now they give up all their livestock. So Pharaoh has all the land, has all the money. Now he has all the livestock. They're going to run out of that. So notice the next year comes, and notice they don't have anything. So notice what they do then. In verse 19, they now then offer up their land and their life. So Pharaoh now owns how much of the land of Egypt?
All of it.
He owns how much of the money? He owns how much of the livestock? All of it. But how much of Judah and the rest of the family, how much of their livestock does he own?
None.
And how much, who's providing all the food for them? And how much of their money do they still have? They have all of it. Who's taking care of it?
God is.
God is. It's amazing when you look at it, if we're just obedient to do what we're told to do. And he owns all of it. Notice then, now what do? 7 years aren't quite up. We don't have anything left. What do we do now? So then notice then, they need seed to plant, but they have nothing. So from that day on, they gave them the land that they could now, they gave them the seed to go work the very lands that used to be theirs, but they're now required to give 20% every year. So instead of 14 years earlier, they got all the proceeds. Now they get 80%, and Pharaoh is going to get 20% from this time on. Was Pharaoh being faithful to? Was Joseph being faithful to Pharaoh? Yes, he was. Was Joseph also taking care of his family? And notice then, he also allowed him to do it. How many of us are doing our work heartily as unto the Lord? How much did Joseph keep for himself? He's doing his work for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's reaping the benefits greatly. How many of us are doing our work unto the Lord wherever we're employed? Are we doing our very best where we're at? It's a choice we make. Joseph made a great choice. And that's one reason why Pharaoh saw it, one reason why he even offered the livestock for his brothers to take care of. So think about it when we come, go down a little bit later too. It's interesting, which I didn't read. Why don't we just jump back, because we've got a couple minutes. Go back to 47, notice in verse 9. Remember we saw how Joseph saw what took place in his life, how God did all these things and took care of him, and how he was down there to save the nation. When Pharaoh meets Jacob, notice in verse 8, Pharaoh asks him how old he is. And notice Jacob's response. The years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years of my father lived during the days of their sojourning. So how does he summarize his life?
Difficult.
Now, how much of the difficulty was because of his own choices? And now, are his sons doing what they need to be doing? Did he get reunited with Joseph? Is Judah doing what he ought to be doing? Has Reuben made some changes? And what? He's still looking at what?
Dark side.
The dark side. He was 147, Abraham was 175, and then Isaac died at 180. So he doesn't live as long. But if that's the case, what about Joseph? He dies when?
110.
110. Does Joseph think, man, it's been terrible. I didn't get to live as long as my dad. How many of us, is it choices we make? Joseph made the right choices. And notice, we all look at, Jacob does good things at times. But so often he doesn't look at what is staring him right in front of him. He still has all his sons. And they're still all with him. And it's because Joseph departed for a while, he saved all of them. Because of God's hand. So let's think about some applications that we have. Notice, how am I looking at my circumstances? Do I look at it as God's provision and God's possibility, or just difficulties? Do I only see obstacles or possibilities, horizontal or vertical? What does God desire of me? What God desires may not be easy. Was it easy for Joseph? You look at any of your Old Testament saints that we look at, all of them had difficult paths with which God put them in. You look at him, was it hard for Daniel? How would you like to be Jeremiah? All the great men of Scripture and women of Scripture, it was not easy. That's why we look up to them. People can look up to you and I if we'll be faithful where we're at. What about how faithful am I to my boss and the people around me, what God's given me to do? When they give you a task, do they have to worry about it getting done or not? I've often heard it said and quite often recognized, if you want a job done, do you give it to the busiest person you know or the person who has the time? Why? Because they find a way to get it done. Well, how about you and I? What does God want me to do? Instead of saying I can't, why don't we say, God, it's not an obstacle, it's an opportunity. How can I get it done? And many times we do need to give things up. 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 We do need to